Hi, good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure what time you'll be viewing this. Apologies for not being able to join you live. I'm on my first holiday in almost 30 months, and we're walking in the west of Ireland. So when Dara contacted me, I had to say, sorry, but I'd love to be joining you live. So what I've done is recorded a presentation with a number of very quick and dirty ideas, and then pose some questions for you at the end. I hope that will be useful. So this is who I am. Those of you who know me, I'm Martin Caraher. I'm Professor Emeritus of Food and Health Policy at City University in London. We're coming to Jerusalem sometime in November for a meeting, so hopefully I can catch up with some of you then. So really apologies for not being able to join you and actually not being able to come to Jerusalem, one of my favorite world cities. So this is to the Israeli Forum on Sustainable Nutrition. Dara, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to focus mainly on the nutrition aspect with a little bit on waste. So let me just get on with it. The background, my standing position on this is that we don't really need to have hunger in the world. What we need is a reform of the food system. And that's a bigger issue probably than we're going to talk about today. But estimates are that we have enough food to feed the world, but we'd have to redistribute it in different ways. Of course, the current issues around the invasion of Ukraine, trade wars with China, fuel price rises have created another dilemma post-COVID lockdowns, and I realize that. But there's really a need for a reform of the food system, and we'll come back to that. As I was sitting down to think about this, 4 pieces of research came into my in tray. So here we have one about corporate, the linking with corporate interests and business domination of food banks in Canada. And Canada and the US have a long history of food banks. One down here from Joel Berg, who set up alternative systems in the US, saying that the world should not follow the failed US model of fighting domestic hunger, which is largely based on charity, but also some welfare provision. And here on the right of the screen, more positive look about looking at, for the UK, looking at how we might envisage food distribution in the future with a win-win scenario of waste food and incorporating food banks. And here's a very positive review done by some people from within the food bank movement itself of European food banks on COVID-19, saying that actually they coped pretty well during the COVID crisis. That's not my reading, I have to say, of the situation. I think there were lots of problems across Europe. I think this comes with a conflict of interest. It should have a conflict of interest declaration. It's done by people from within the food banking system. So let's just remind us that food insecurity this is the classic USDA concept of mild, moderate, and severe food insecurity. My colleague, who's now retired, Liz Dowler, talked about food poverty. We tend to talk about food poverty in the UK as the inability to consume an adequate quality and quantity of food in socially acceptable ways, or the uncertainty that one will not be able to do so. Now, one of the problems I have with lots of the food insecurity data is that it's point in time, it's not predictive. So if any of you are interested, I've been doing some work with colleagues in West Australia about using predictive models. So we can measure at a point in time, and indeed we saw this with COVID. At a point in time, we had X people in food insecurity. 2 months later, that had massively increased because it was the uncertainty. People on low-income jobs that went that were shut down during lockdown, people on insecure employment, etc., etc. We didn't pick up the predictive issue there. So if you think about, since the 1970s, we're setting nutrition standards which are often set at subsistence levels and they don't address the social, mental, and moral sides of food consumption. Depending on which political party is in power in which country, this became a ceiling above which those in receipt of benefits could not rise, as opposed to a floor below which they should not fall. And the idea was to encourage work, not welfare. So here in the UK and lots of European countries, formal welfare was set at very low levels and people were referred to food banks. And there's a shame, all the research shows a shame attached to people using food banks. This led to debates over the deserving and undeserving poor. Who deserved welfare, who didn't deserve it? Okay, next slide. So we saw the growth of the food banking movement outside the US since the 1970s. Since the 1970s, food banks were big in the US. Since the 2000s, they've grown exponentially outside of the US. Countries you would not expect to see them in now have food banks. Some of us, me included, see food banks as successful failures. They say, well, we shouldn't really be here, but they continue to grow. And one of the reasons for that is a means, particularly charity-based ones, of engaging their volunteers. There's lots of pilots around food banks and what I call pilot-itis. So governments are unsure what to do. So let's have a pilot. Let's have a food bank distributing food in different ways. But they're never really embedded into formal governance. They were originally established as an antidote to food waste. I think they've almost lost sight of that, but here in the UK, certainly I think that's true. The increases in food poverty and inequality. And as I said, now, the situation is completely different. Globally, we are seeing massive rises in food insecurity, falling incomes relative to food prices going up, and people losing jobs, increases in fuel, et cetera, Ukrainian crisis, the shortage of wheat globally across the world. We're seeing famine emerge linked with climate change, climate emergencies. It's pretty horrible out there. But we are seeing globally increases in food poverty and inequality. Will food banks or modifications of them be able to cope with that? We're seeing austerity being used as a political movement motive for changing welfare provision and a focus on individual culpability and responsibility. That's certainly true in neoliberal economies, capitalist economies, where we've got to cut back. So austerity, one way of doing that is not to give people cash for food, but to refer them to food banks to use food waste or food surpluses. We have seen a lot of very positive pandemic responses during COVID, with local communities setting up initiatives. I've got some examples from Colombia, where local communities establish new food chains and food links. The problem is, will they last beyond the COVID initiative? We know from previous research from 2008 that there were lots of community initiatives. They weren't sustainable because we didn't invest in them. They were community-based. Communities need some level of help to make these initiatives sustainable. But there are lots of good examples from pandemic responses about local food supply chains and closed loop economies. Okay, so I think we should remember the 2008 Great Recession. What's happening now is, of course, much more acute than that. But we didn't learn from the 2008 Great Recession, where cutbacks to public services on the basis of austerity, focus on behavioral interventions. We did see some focus on at-risk groups such as children, so through school meals and nutrition supplementation programs. But the big issue for me is what's called the triple burden of nutrition. So that's overnutrition and micronutrient deficiency, and social nutrition is missing. I think it's actually the fourfold aspect of malnutrition. We're seeing the divorce of food poverty and insecurity from poverty campaigns. They're now run by different organizations. One of my colleagues here in the UK, Michael Marmot, talks about the debate. The problem is poverty, and of course food poverty is related to that. But what we've got separate policies. We've got a food poverty, we've got a food poverty strategy, it's inadequate. We've got an inadequate obesity strategy. But actually, if we go back to the root causes, they're the same. And that's what we need to look at, I think, in many ways. I constantly draw on the shooter's work. He was the previous UN Special Rapporteur on Food. And in 2013, in a talk in London, he said, food assistance in the form of the right to social security, such as cash transfers, food stamps or vouchers, as is very common in the US, can be defined in terms of rights, whereas food banks are charity-based and depend on donations and goodwill. There can also be a sense of shame attached to food banks. And his point is that welfare provision is a right, whereas food banks are a charity provision. And I'm not saying food banks are going to disappear, but I think at best they can only be partial responses. So there are, I think, examples if you look wider abroad. The STOP Community Food Center, I've given you a link to that there. The Belo Horizonte program in Brazil, in the city of Belo Horizonte, has attempted to end hunger. The governance of food banks in Brazil, there is regulation. There are three sorts of food banks. There are private food banks, essentially charity-based. There's government food banks, and there's those in between. And for government food banks, and those in between, which may be a mix of charity and government, they have to meet nutrition standards and supply standards. So they have to buy locally, they have to include local food, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of talk about reinventing food banks. That's this book here has just recently appeared from Katie Martin. I mean, I think it's just tinkering around the edges, this book. I think it's interesting to read, but it's not, for me, it's not really a solution. People are exploring other means of distribution, such as social or solidarity supermarkets and co-ops, which are member-based, so people pay a small amount and still have to pay for the food, but it's enormously reduced from what you would get in a normal retail shop. And these are seen as being more acceptable. Negative examples from the world of from the global world. This is Andy Fisher's book on Big Hunger, where he talks about the unholy alliance between corporate America and anti-hunger groups. This is becoming much more of a concern. It's certainly a concern I have here in the UK and in Europe generally. There's a global food banking network. They've been lobbying governments in Europe and the UK, going to parliaments and saying, listen, we will run your food welfare provision for you. We will set up food banks and they will become the default position for food welfare. The food industry have a vested interest in many ways around food waste and giving it to charities. They then don't have to pay for landfill. The charity industry itself has a vested interest. The agricultural lobby, I mean, this is more large probably in the US and Canada, where the agricultural lobby and agricultural farmers essentially contribute to the food, directly to food banks and food wastes. And there are links between these above. I mean, Andy Fisher here called it the unholy alliance between corporate America and anti-hunger. I'm going to show you some examples from the UK in a moment to illustrate this point. It's some work that's in train that we're doing. So 20 years of food banks globally, with a longer history in Canada and the US, have shown no overall improvement underpinning food poverty rates or food insecurity. The record on food waste is more mixed. The distribution charities claim low levels of waste, but research shows that the level of the food pantry or food bank, there can be up to 25% waste. So the reason for that is, you probably noticed, the food bank, the food distribution center sends it on to the local food bank who feel they can't refuse it, but they have really no use for it, or they can't, it's outside of their skill to make use of it in a meal. So they then just send it straight to waste. So, and they do that because they feel they can't turn it down because they might not get the next food offer. So there's a lot of debate around that. There's links with unhealthy food commodity industries are increasing, and not just food donations. I'll show you some slides in a moment about this. This is really, really worrying trend. There's evidence linking the pandemic that food banks could not meet the increased demand. They had a lack of records, so they didn't know, where to contact users. They didn't know who was at risk. They had a lack of infrastructure. Their own volunteers went off sick. So, and a lot of them were probably in at-risk groups. It tended to be elderly volunteers. Donations sank, both from the food industry, but also personal donations from say, members of the church. And now, as I keep saying, there's a new austerity biting on all of this. We're seeing decreases in food bank donations within supermarkets as people themselves are suffering from a roughly 15 to 20% rise in some food commodities here in the UK. Overall inflation is running at about 9.7%, but food inflation of some basic goods is running at 20%. So those people who in the past might have been donating to a food bank stop donating. Okay, so this is the unhealthy food commodity industries. And the links with these have moved beyond them just donating food. So here, let me just pick an example. Here's Fairshare, which is one of our major distributors of food in the UK. They're like a wholesaler. And they've joined forces with McDonald's to provide 1 million meals for UK families. Here we have links with Fairshare, which is our main charity provider of food banks. They operate on a franchise basis, mainly Anglican, but not exclusively churches. So they franchise out, and they've got into links with Coca-Cola. So they're working directly with the unhealthy food commodity industries. And the other two this is Trussell Trust again, working with Cadbury's. And this is, again, Coca-Cola initiative, across Coca-Cola, sugar consumption packs, so to win food-related vouchers while donating to Fairshare. This is direct links with the unhealthy food commodity industries. Now, I'm not saying this shouldn't be happening, but I think there is a conflict of interest for many of those of us who work in the nutrition field. This is work we're involved in. I can at another stage go into more details than that. So I'm coming to the conclusions. I'm trying to wrap this up. Some questions and issues for you. Of course, we should be using the power and influence and the lobby of the food bank movement, but how? Food banks are not going to go away. That's the reality. But how do we lobby them? How do we get them to lobby for more change? And what do we lobby for? I mean, the food bank movement say, well, we shouldn't be here. But are they really going to lobby for their own demise? I don't think they're going to disappear. So what's the new food bank movement going to look like? This issue of food versus cash aid and cash transfers is a big debate in academic circles at the moment. We know from developing nations that cash aid is better than food aid. Giving people cash to buy food, except in times of famine, is a better option. And we know that women particularly use cash better to feed their families rather than just giving them food. So what are the implications for nutrition professionals of linking with a food industry, which is essentially ecologically and nutritionally destructive? There are ethics and conflicts of interest. How do we deal with these? So you could be doing some work for a food bank, and the next thing you're in debate with Coca-Cola over sugary drinks for a national nutrition standard. And if you go and read Andy Fisher's book, which I highlighted, I think it's chapter 4, chapter 5, he's got a case study in there where this actually happened. Within a nutrition department, some people were working with the food bank, and then it came time to argue nutrition standards, and there was a sudden conflict of interest, which Coca-Cola were not, the sugar industry were not above making use of. So what's called eco-nutrition or sustainable diets, how do we link this with food waste? Is this about circular economies? Is this about encouraging the industry to cut down on waste? We know the retail industry have cut down on waste, but there'll always be some waste in a system which is dependent on customers, because they want me to buy their goods and not go across the street and buy the goods in another supermarket. But they have significantly cut down. So how do we link food waste with eco-nutrition and sustainable diets? So those are some questions for you just to consider, and maybe you'd want to think about them. I'm going to end the presentation now. There'll be a sort of slightly messy bit where I turn this off on Zoom, and I'm just ending the meeting and then hopefully saving this presentation. Okay. Thank you very much, and good luck with your deliberations today.